Okay, so we can start off. So everybody, this is John. He is our guest speaker today. I'll let him introduce himself, but I wanted to ask if everyone could mute themselves. And then we have a whole list of questions. I'm going to ask John the questions that we've all put together. And if you have any other question that comes up, if you could just type it into the chat box, we'll make sure we get to that at the end. So take it away, John.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Hickey. I'm a funeral director with Sitkowski, Malbuff, and Hickey and Scanlon Funeral Service here in Webster. I've been doing this since 1984. I'm a lot older than I look. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you all this evening. We'll start with the questions from Jess and go forward from there.
Wonderful. So the first question that we have today is, what do funeral directors do?
The simple answer is we handle the disposition of deceased people, or in the simple, more than that, is we handle dead bodies. And we take care of the final disposition of those, whether it's burial, cremation, donation, it's whatever the family chooses.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is pre-planning? And we have kind of a couple questions after that is, who should pre-plan their funeral arrangements and when should people plan their funeral?
Pre-planning is basically making funeral arrangements either for yourself or another person before the event happens. That could be days, it could be months, it could be decades. It's whatever the need is or whatever you feel the need is. The question is, who should pre-plan? Ideally, everyone. When should people plan their funerals? When should people plan their funeral home? Is that what you meant to ask?
I think it meant when should they plan their funeral?
Okay. A lot of times people do it when a death occurs in their own family or in a family close to theirs. And it makes them think about their own mortality at that time. And geez, we don't have anything ready for this. And, should we do something now? A lot of it has to do with, well, geez, we've got young kids, the lives are too hectic right now. But by the same token, you could ask yourself, who's going to take care of it if you don't? Who is going to do what you want done? And ideally, the best time to make arrangements are when you're thinking clearly and not at an emotional time. When you have the time to actually think about what it is that you want for arrangements, and you've had a chance to discuss this with either your significant other, your spouse, your children, your parents, whomever, whatever you decide to do and whenever you decide to do it, make sure you let other people know, hey, I've done this. I've got all the paperwork here, but if not, this is where I've got it done. Because a lot of times people tell us, well, we know he's got a prearrangement, but we don't know where. So they wind up calling all the area funeral homes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was great. Can we have a viewing of the remains even if there will not be a service?
You absolutely can. The question, there's a couple of other questions that get triggered by that particular question. Now, when you're talking about viewing of the remains, even if there's not a service, does that mean you want to see them as they are when they come from the hospital or the nursing home or from the house? Or do you want them prepared for viewing and have what's known as a viewing container before they either go to the crematory or in a casket before they go to the cemetery? There's a lot of different options and there's a lot of different answers to that question, obviously. The only time that you may not have a real chance to see somebody is if there's an anatomical donation. A lot of times the hospitals will make arrangements to have the people picked up from the hospital. So if that death happens there, then you have to make arrangements before they're taken to see them.
Now, would someone just ask you as a funeral director what their options were? Or would you tell them if they said, I want to see my loved one right after the nursing home, I want to make sure I see their body, or can I have a viewing before they get cremated? Would they just speak to you about that?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be just about cremation. This can be any type of service. We have a lot of folks that decide that they don't want to be viewed, but they want a traditional service. Well, the family comes in and says, can we see them? Well, sure, of course you can. We can't tell you can't.
Right, right. Wonderful. Um, if I've never planned a funeral before, what do I need to know?
You'd need to know what you think your loved one, your wife, husband, whomever, what are their religious beliefs? Do they have any? What would they want for a service? Do they want a service? You also need to know their biographical background to build up the what we need for information for a death certificate. We ask a lot of questions when we meet with the families, and a lot of them are geared towards just filling out the paperwork for the state of Massachusetts, which is the death certificate. And there are questions that are asked if you're going to do an obituary, which can come in any form. You can have obituaries that are published in the newspaper, which there's a fee for, and you can have obituaries that are published on your funeral home's website, which most funeral homes today have a website. So it gives you an option of alerting people and letting them know that there is something that's happened. And our local newspaper, the Telegram and Gazette, still allows us to put in what's called a free notice. You'll see the regional deaths for that day, and it'll list the town. So we can list the person and say what they did or did not want for arrangements. And it lists the funeral home. And that gives most people the idea, okay, now I've got to go to the funeral home website and read the whole obit. The other things you're going to want to know are the decedent's social security number. Were they married? And if they were married and divorced, who was their last spouse? What was their last spouse's maiden name? Where were their parents born? So they're going to want to know not only who the mother and father were, what the mother's maiden name was, and what town and state or country they were born in. And you get a lot of blank looks sometimes when you ask those questions, especially if you're dealing with a younger generation who's not that in tune with some of the previous generations, and they kind of look at you like a deer in a headlight and say, how do we find this out? We have ways of doing that. We can contact the town clerk where the person was born, and most of the time we'll get the parents' information off of a birth certificate. If there was an adoption, we may have a little bit of issue there, but it's usually not a big problem. Same with Social Security. If you don't have or can't find a Social Security number, sometimes we can contact the police. And if the person had a driver's license, they may be able to look them up that way and help us out with Social Security. But those are basic information. If the person was a veteran, we would ask you to, if they're going to want to do anything in the line of veteran services or having a flag or a burial marker, if they're entitled to it, we would ask for the discharge papers that the person has, and they have to be honorable to qualify for these things. And it's called a DD 214. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question has a bunch of other questions underneath it. So it's basically about different funeral arrangement options. So you did answer this, and it says, do I have the ability to personalize these services?
You absolutely do. And that can be from bringing in photographs to bringing in, if somebody was crafty and made different things, displaying those in the funeral home or in the church or wherever they're having a service. That also, we have the opportunity downstairs here to have a video collage as well. We've added in smart TVs to both funeral homes so that through either a laptop or a flash drive, families can play either videos that they have of the people or photographs. There are funeral homes that offer the option of creating a video disc of this, but they're generally fairly pricey, usually a couple $100.
Wow.
And it's basically you're bringing us all of your photos, we're scanning them and putting them in, which is a huge amount of work. What I find the easiest thing to do, and it's therapeutic, frankly, for a family, is have the family go through these photos and choose what they want. And a lot of times what they wind up doing is saying, geez, do you remember when we were here? Or do you remember this photo when this was, we had such a great time here. Or geez, she had a horrible time. Do you remember when the seagull hit her when we were at the seashore? Those are the sorts of things that people love to sit and talk about, which is why a lot of these video collages and even the video boards that we set up where families bring us in pictures from their birth through their wedding to their older years. A lot of people congregated these because they're great memories. And, you want to focus on a life that was lived. It's not just about how soon we can get somebody out of here, and I don't feel comfortable doing this. It's a lot of it is therapeutic.
Wonderful. So it does seem like this one you've just answered as well. If my loved one is not active in a church or congregation, can they still have a funeral or a memorial service?
Yes. And a lot of the non-denominational churches, the ones that are either Bible-based or the non-Catholic churches, they're very open to doing services no matter where you are. The Catholic Church for a long time would tell us that if you weren't a member or you didn't go to church, we actually had to plead with the priests sometimes to try to get services. And over the last 15 years, that's changed tremendously. In the last 5, we were told that the priest will not come to the funeral home to do a service in the funeral home. They want you to go to church. And then they finally realized that somebody else in the family says, well, my minister will come and do it. And they're realizing, maybe we should come to the funeral home. Sometimes through their own stubbornness, they don't realize how much you can hurt people. But, it doesn't matter if you want to have a church service or a service in a funeral home or a service even in a restaurant someplace, to do a memorial service with a luncheon afterwards, hopefully when COVID goes away. It depends on the minister or the priest, but they're fairly open to doing a lot of stuff these days, which is good. And they no longer ask, well, geez, were they a member of the congregation? Because, I didn't see an envelope from them last month. So thankfully that's changing.
Great. Now the next questions are about specific options. So this one is about the basically donating your body. So how do I donate my loved one's body for medical research?
Okay, that is called an anatomical gift. Generally what happens is you would have contacted the medical school, which could either be UMass or some of these medical schools in Boston even, Tufts or Harvard, and you would tell them you're interested in signing up for the anatomical gift program. Now, what happens is when a death occurs, they are notified either through the family or through one of us. And they generally make arrangements these days. We haven't done this in a while. They make the arrangements to bring the person to the medical school. Now, this is one of those cases where if you want to have a service with the person present at the service, you can't do this with an anatomical gift. Generally what happens is at the end of their research, which could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, they will call to let you know that the person that has donated their body is ready. And what that means is that generally they've cremated them. Now you have 2 options. They will either scatter or bury the cremains, or they will give them back to the family for their own personal memorialization, be that either in a cemetery or scattering at their favorite ocean place or even kept at home. So that's, those are the options you've got. But with that anatomical gift, there is no viewing, there is no open casket, there's nothing of that nature. It is also the least expensive way of disposition. It's also something that gives you, hopefully the idea that you're helping to further medical science, but there is a caveat. If you are too large for them, they will not take you. If you're too thin, they will not take you. If you've died of specific diseases, they will not take you. Right now, I don't believe they're taking them during COVID. There's, they're very finicky about what they do. We did have a case where the gentleman passed away. We brought him to UMass and received a phone call the following day, said, "We're done." We were shocked. We then called the family and said, the hospital just told us that they're done with your brother. What would you like to do with him now? They didn't cremate. They didn't do anything to him. They didn't even touch him. I don't understand why they didn't, but they immediately released him back to us. And that is a possibility. Just because you donate does not mean that they're going to accept at the time of death or that they're going to keep them.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm being a little long-winded. Go ahead.
No, this is so helpful and great information. So the next one is about cremation. So I'm sure you'll answer all of these questions. I'll kind of ask them now. I'm sure you'll address. So it's, what is cremation? What do I need to do if my loved one wants to be cremated? Is it a substitute for a funeral? And you did address this, you can view the body if someone's being cremated. And are all the cremated remains returned? Okay.
That's a lot in one question.
It is.
Okay. What is cremation? Cremation is essentially the incineration of the body, reducing it down to basically inorganic bone fragments, which then get put through a processor and are then supposed to be pulverized to a point where they're almost a powder. Not quite, but almost. If you've ever opened a bag of cement, that's more what the cremains look like. They're almost a gray, whitish color. Sometimes there's little chunks of bits left in it. You can do an entirely traditional funeral, which is calling hours, open casket, go to church, and at the end of the Mass or the service, the person is then taken off to the crematory, cremated, and the remains are either interred or given back to the family. It happened with my own sister-in-law this past year. She died at 52, just the day before Christmas. Oh. What's the other question you had?
Oh,
is it a substitute for a funeral?
Yes.
Well, the question comes, are you looking to not have a funeral? Are you hoping that by just cremating, that's the end of everything and that nothing else goes beyond that? It can be that way. It's up to the individuals who are left in charge. We have families that have made prearrangements where the loved ones, the next of kin, come in and tell us that, oh no, we're not doing that. Even though you prearrange, it does not guarantee that the family is going to follow what your wishes are. And you can't really put a codicil in your will that says, if they don't follow my wishes, they're all out of the will. Because we've asked the lawyers about that, and they've pretty much said it's up to the family. The family can make the decisions. Even though we've had families that were not churchgoers, but their mother went to church every day. She went to Mass every single day of her life. But because they were disenchanted with the church and wanted nothing to do with it, they refused to have their mother go to church, and we had to honor their wishes.
Oh, my goodness. The next question is interesting. It's, are all the cremated remains returned?
We use, I answered, I certainly hope so. We use a crematory in Worcester. That's the name of it is Rural. We've been using them since the 40s. We've never had an issue with them. We've never had a bad article written about them through the years. When we take a person and bring them and leave them with the crematory, we place an enormous amount of trust that what they do is what we intend them to do. I have seen them at the end of a cremation open the retort and literally sweep out. Now, are you going to get every molecule of ash that comes out? No, that's just the reality. The bricks that are in the burning retort, they're fairly porous to a point. So with the exception of vacuuming with a HEPA filter, you're not going to get every little thing. You're going to get 99% of it. All right. Now, you asked after that, do you need an urn? That depends on what you're going to do with the cremains afterwards. There are some cemeteries that will not bury cremains unless they're in what's known as an urn vault, which is it's a combination of both an urn and a vault, or unless they're buried in a concrete box, which they're calling a vault as well. The simple answer is, if you're not burying them, no, you don't need an urn. An urn is a preference as to what you want to do. We've actually brought the box that comes back from the crematory to church. A lot of times we'll tell the family, buy a wreath of flowers from the florist, and we put them around the box. It looks perfectly fine.
So that you could just use that box and take that with you to do whatever you'd like. You don't need a specific urn.
No, but each family's different. I mean,
Right.
Some families want an urn, some families want the small keepsake urns, some families want cremation jewelry. We try to take care of doing all of that if they buy it, putting the cremains in the jewelry or the other pieces. We don't like to try to have the family do this themselves. It's hard. It's actually hard for us to give a box back to a person and say, here's your mom. From the last time you saw her to what you're getting now, it's a bit of a shock to some folks, unless you've seen it before. We're probably cutting off our nose to spite our face, but if you come to us and tell us you're looking to have jewelry or keepsake urns, we'll actually tell you, go online. There's several websites out there that sell cremation jewelry and urns and all sorts of different options and what have you, more than I could possibly show you in just the small book I've got. But my point to them always is, I can't buy the jewelry that you're buying online from my distributor at the price you're getting it online. It's actually cheaper to buy it from the website than it is for me to buy it from my distributors. So I 9 times out of 10 will tell people that, go online and find this stuff. And, you'll see a huge amount of options, even personalization, where you can have things engraved and what have you.
I've seen that. I've even seen glass blown with the ashes.
That you can actually have gemstones made from ashes. We're probably very bad business people, but I would much prefer someone find something that they really want as opposed to just picking something because it's all we have.
Right. The next topic we have is burial. So what is a traditional burial, and is burial space becoming scarce?
Traditional burial is generally a casket that's placed inside a concrete vault that's buried in the ground. The question about burial space becoming scarce, we're not in the cities. I mean, some of the cities like New York or some of those areas are having a hard time with burial space, and you're paying a huge premium for it. Even out towards Boston, where real estate's expensive, we had a burial out there 18 years ago, and it was, we thought, ridiculously expensive then. There's a lot of options, though. What people aren't aware of is you can do 2 full burials in a single grave. It's called double deep. The first person gets buried a little bit deeper, the second person's placed on top. You've now taken what is a normal 2 or 4 grave burial lot and doubled the size of it just by double burying. There's still open space. There's still areas that you can go to. Most of our cemeteries around here still have some open space for burial. Is there another option, you ask? There is a green option, although frankly, we've never dealt with it as of yet. We've been asked about it. I've had a woman who wanted absolutely nothing done to her, and she wanted to be buried in the same vault that her husband was already in. And because there was such a long period of time and there was nothing done to him at the time, we were able to place her casket, which was very minimal, because that's what she wanted. Don't spend anything, keep it as simple as possible. And we were able to place it and put the vault cover back on, because after a while, some of these very minimal caskets do eventually break down. So
we're actually having the Massachusetts Green Burial Committee speak next month on Earth Day, so that'll be interesting.
I'm sure it will.
So our next question is, what is the purpose of embalming, and is it mandatory or required by law?
Okay. Embalming is, and always has been, well, shouldn't say it that way. It's temporary preservation of remains. It's also looked at a disinfection of remains. In my early embalming book from the 80s, when I was in school, they listed some of the jobs of the funeral director or the embalmer was to safeguard the public health. So one of the things that's done during embalming is it kills a lot of viruses, it kills a lot of bacteria, not just internally, but externally. There's a lot of things that cannot live without a host. And that includes this current virus. I've had at least 16 people that have been embalmed through this, and more that haven't. But there's still we have to be very cautious when we first approach them to start the process. Because if you're in the medical field, you understand that when you move someone, even if they're deceased, it causes pressure on the body, which can expel air from the lungs, which means you could potentially get this virus depending on how soon you get the person after their death. The only cause of death that we've been instructed through the years to really stay away from was Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which was known as, you get it from, it's mad cow disease in humans, bovine spongiform encephalitis. And it was highly, highly contagious. You were not supposed to have any contact with any of the bodily fluids. And a lot of time, I've only seen 2 cases in the last 37 years. Now, have I embalmed somebody that had it and we weren't told? That's a possibility, because I've embalmed people who have AIDS that the hospital never informed us that they had it. I've embalmed COVID cases that we were informed afterwards, oh, by the way, this person had COVID. And I understand and fully appreciate HIPAA, but when you're dealing with putting somebody's life at risk, and they tell you you should be taking universal precautions, well, that's all well and fine. But I'm not going to be dressing up in a spacesuit every time I walk into the embalming room. Not to mention the fact that it gets extremely expensive.
Right.
You know, we were helped out by the Massachusetts Emergency Management Association, the MEMA.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to get us some of the N95 masks and some of the face masks that go with them, the shields. But going forward, trying to buy that stuff, I bought a box of 20 and it was $100.
Right.
Now, every time we have a person with COVID or we suspect COVID, um, I have to send guys to the hospital, the nursing home. They have to wear N95 masks. Then I have to wear one. So that's three before we've even started working. So they go very quickly.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Where were we here? Oh, is embalming required by law and is it mandatory? No. There is no law in Massachusetts that says a body has to be embalmed. You'll find very few funeral homes, though, that will allow you to have an open casket with the public coming in where the person is not embalmed. There are some religious groups. I think Russian Orthodox does not want you to embalm. And I think even some Hindu were against some of that being done. That being said, most funeral homes, as do we, will tell you there's no law that says you have to, but if you're planning on having an open casket, we require it. There are too many things that can go wrong. There are too many problems that can arise from having an unembalmed body in the open with family and folks around.
What are your biggest concerns in that regard?
One of my biggest concerns is the purge. Having bodily fluids coming up through either the mouth or the nose, which can either come from sometimes the lungs or the stomach. And sometimes when that starts, it doesn't stop. Right. There's also the problem that, it's not easy. I've done it. It's not easy to dress someone that's unembalmed. You can do it. It's hard to get clothing on, especially if the body is a little clammy or slightly moist. You can disinfect folks. There's a lot of stuff you can do that you don't have to have an embalming for. Like I said, you can have the family come in privately and instruct them, let them know, this is meant to be a brief time for you to say goodbye without, the whole public. That being said, we had 40 people show up for one of those once, which kind of went beyond what we were expecting. But, there's no law that says you have to embalm. There are issues if you're going overseas or transporting outside of the state, depending on where you're going. Some states will tell you you can't cross lines with an unembalmed body. We really haven't seen that as an issue.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, what is the average cost of a funeral?
That's tantamount to asking, how much does a car cost? Well, what do you want to buy? Do you want to buy a Hyundai? Do you want to buy a Mercedes? Do you want to buy a Toyota? For us, an average funeral is about $7,000 to $10,000 dollars. And a lot of it varies with the cost of the casket, what you choose. As I told you with jewelry, we're not salespeople. I will show you a book, tell you what's in it, explain what it is, and then generally leave you to look through the book so you can have a frank discussion with your family members while I go up and start typing up an obituary. It gives the family an opportunity to look at these things and have that time where they're not being given a hard sell or being told, this is the last thing you'll be able to do for mom, or I'd rather be left alone and make a decision without being pressured into it. So that's what we do for our families.
What is the cheapest option?
Anatomical donation. Now, you're talking cheapest option for a funeral or cheapest option for disposition?
Well, I guess both. So without a funeral, it would be the donation.
Okay.
And with a funeral, what would be the cheapest option?
Well, if you're dealing with a funeral that has a body present, you can do a lot of things that will reduce the price of a funeral. One of them is, come in, have a private viewing, and then have everything meet at church. Which cuts down on the extra expense, because every funeral home charges you not only for calling hours, but for the morning of the funeral itself, because we hire least we do, on average, 8 people are working our funerals.
Mm.
Before COVID started, I expect doors to be opened, umbrellas to be pulled out to, help ladies into the house. Nobody wants a wet head. I want cars parked, doors opened, doing as much public service as you can. I mean, we are essentially a service business. And it's that's partly what adds to the price of our funerals, because we tend to hire a lot of folks, even for calling hours. I've got usually 2 people in the parking lot and 1 person at the door. And that doesn't include one of us walking around, making sure everything's taken care of, or seeing to different stuff that's going on.
Great. And do funeral homes vary in price?
Oh, yes, widely.
What do you recommend for families who say, well, how do I find the best price or the most reasonable price?
Well, if you're looking around trying to figure out what funeral home you want to go to, or even if you're just quizzical, trying to figure out what do things cost, if you contact us and tell us, I want a general price list, which is this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's supposed to, from A to Z, everything that the funeral home offers. Now, there's quite a bit of info, and there's even a back page for us.
Wow.
Every funeral home is required to furnish you with a general price list, not a number written down on a piece of paper or on the back of a business card, a general price list. And if they're not handing you one, ask them why. They're required to have them. And prices vary from funeral home to funeral home for several different reasons. Some don't have a lot of overhead. They've been in business for years. Some have been in business for years, but do renovations and try to keep up on the constant maintenance that some of these older buildings require, including the yard work, the parking lots. Just the plowing bills for us can be outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
And that all of that adds into, well, how much does a funeral cost? We try to do stuff in a way, we've prided ourselves on not being the least, but not being the most expensive. We try to stay in the middle of the road. By the same token, we all have to make a living doing this. I don't ever expect to die rich doing this, unless my wife cashes in my insurance policies. But this is not something I went into to become a millionaire.
Right.
It's something you do because you feel that you can help people through one of the hardest times in their lives. And it's usually one of the lowest spots, and it's one of the darkest places that they have to emerge from.
Mm.
And yes, every funeral home has a different price.
That's great information, though. I didn't know about the general price list.
Yeah, they are required, and don't let them tell you otherwise. You only have to call them and tell them that you want one sent to you.
That's great.
And they have to, and if they don't, call back and ask why, or call the board in Boston and ask, because we are regulated by the Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers in Boston.
Okay.
So, if anyone ever has a complaint against a funeral home, that's where you go.
Great. The next question we have is, do I need to have funeral arrangements lined up if there will not be a funeral service?
Well, you've got to have spoken to somebody about what you're going to do with the disposition of the remains, be that a cremation or a direct burial or whatever it is you've chosen to do. You can either do prearrangements where you come in and talk about them before, and you can pay for them at the time, or you can do informational prearrangements where you come in, talk to us, give us all the information, tell us what you want, and then don't pay for it. We've all had that happen. We would prefer to see you fund it, and not just because it's an asset to us, which it technically is not. Prearrangement money does not belong to us. it is either in a trust or it is in an insurance. Now, the trusts today, we're actually a member with one of them in Massachusetts, New England Funeral Trust. And we've also had trusts in the hometown bank in town. They actually changed their status from a whatever institution they were to a limited trust institution so that they could keep what they had from us for prearrangements. But the problem has come that the interest rates now are so low, and every bank is living by making fees and telling you there's an administrative fee for this. We're actually losing money right now on trusts at the bank, where it's actually costing us a little bit of money for each prearrangement we have with them. We have changed over to either insurances or annuities at this point. My business partner went to become a licensed insurance salesman. I've been putting it off. I'd rather watch grass grow than try to figure out what is involved with insurance. I've tried to take the course twice and I fell asleep both times. But I should do it. I have to do it. There is, and this full disclosure, most insurances do offer the salesperson a commission. It's generally 3%. Unless the person is terminally ill and it's being a direct funded insurance, or they're extremely elderly. And then it's put into what we call an annuity that does not pay a commission, because a lot of times if we get paid a commission and the person dies before a year, we have to give the commission back to the insurance company, or if we don't, it's deducted from the amount of money that's sent to us to cover the cost of the funeral.
Oh. Then the next question we have is, my loved one just passed. What do I do next?
Okay, that depends on where they died and how they died. If now I know you folks are hospice.
Yes.
Ideally, folks die at home, surrounded by the people who've loved them and cared for them. When that happens, if you're on hospice and a person dies and you die at home, then the first call you make is to the hospice so that they can send a nurse out to take care of the pronouncing of the person actually dead. And after you've called the nurse, you then contact the funeral home. Let the funeral home know that mom or whomever passed away. The nurse is on their way, and the nurse will call you when she's ready for you to come. Because sometimes it's an hour or so or more before a nurse can get to a home. If you're not on hospice and you come in and find mom, dad, whomever dead in the house, the first call you make is to the police. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive, but that's where you have to start. You call the police. The police will then come to the house. They will assess the situation. Did the person die of natural causes? Were they murdered? A lot of different stuff that can go into it. Is there something suspicious about the circumstances? They then call the medical examiner's office. Medical examiner has authority over all deaths in the state. So no matter what happens, if the medical examiner decides they want to see that person, then no matter what you protest, it matters not. They're going to take them to either Boston or Westfield right now, which is outside of Springfield. The Worcester satellite office for the medical examiner is closed right now because of COVID. The hospital at UMass does not have the space, so they've closed that for the temporary time being. But they will then tell you, either the medical examiner will say to them, we want to see them, in which case they send out their own people to pick up the person, or you can contact the funeral home. And when they do, that's when they call us. Now, depending on where we are at the time this happens, and we all live on cell phones these days, there was a time that we always had somebody here at the building answering the phone, no matter what time of the day or night. Those days are gone. You can't be tied down. You've got to be running around this, you're dropping something off or someone calls you to come pick up. So, you've got to be fairly flexible and available. And besides that, a lot of us have family lives where your kids need to get to school or you've got to pick up groceries. While we were doing this, my son texted, could you pick up milk on the way home? So sometimes you have to give us a little time, but generally within an hour of your phone call, we've got the men either on the way there or making their way to the house if they're not there already. Depends on where we are during the day.
The next question is, how is the body transported?
Well, if they die at home, I will, unless instructed otherwise, I will send the hearse to the house. To me, it's more dignified. I would much prefer have the hearse go to the house than we do have a removal van, which is basically a Chrysler Town and Country, which we generally use for hospitals, nursing homes, and some of the hospice residents. But when it's a home death, we generally send the hearse, unless the family says, I don't want that black thing in my driveway. It's happened, but it's generally up to the family. We come in, assess the situation if it's at home, figure out what's the best way to get the person out of the house. Are they on the first, second, third floor? Are they very large? Do we need more help? But generally we use a stretcher. It looks like a regular ambulance cot. It's a little bit smaller. One of them is rated, I believe, for 400 pounds. I've more recently purchased one that's rated for 1,000 pounds that I hope never to have to use for that purpose. Because if you get to that point, then I'm calling in the emergency group from the fire department or the rescue squad. They'll send us help. I've had situations in the past where I just couldn't get somebody out of the house without the help, and that's with 3 people having to go forward and getting other folks to help us.
Wow.
It doesn't happen often, but unfortunately with COVID, I'm much larger than I was when I started all of this. So, it's understandable. We're all sitting at home or, trying not to get out or do too much, which means we can't get to the gym. We can't do what we want to do. And you wind up eating.
And stress always causes us to eat more too.
Especially when you're home with your family.
The next question we have is, I'm traveling with my loved one and we're not in the same state as the elected funeral home. What do I do?
Okay. Let's say you're in New Hampshire or California or wherever you are, you're traveling. If you're in the United States, for the most part, this is the simplest scenario. You will hopefully have either a relationship with your funeral home or some member of your family that's had a relationship with the funeral home. Call your local funeral director. Tell them what's happened, that we can all make arrangements to get a person back to this hometown from no matter where they are in the country. There is a service that's run throughout the country called National Mortuary Shipping. And we can transport either an embalmed person back to the state or a cremated person. Granted, if you're transporting the embalmed person back, then you have airline costs because you obviously have to fly them here from a farther place. Or if it's not that far, we would contact a funeral home up in New Hampshire or even Maine and say, would you remove the person from the hospital, do the embalming, and we will drive up to pick them up. So generally within the states in New England, we will actually drive up to pick up somebody.
Okay, and that actually answers the next question. What do I do if my loved one dies far away from home? And then the last one you kind of answered earlier. What happens if I use a funeral out of state? So we've had people who are in nursing homes in Massachusetts, but they want to use the funeral home in Maine. Same concept.
Instruct them to contact the funeral home that they've had a relationship with through the years and let them know that either mom, dad, or whomever is in Massachusetts in a nursing home, but when something happens, we want you to handle the funeral. So the nursing home is then instructed that the first place they call is not some local funeral director, but the one in Maine or wherever they are, and let them make the arrangements to get the person back if they don't want to come down themselves immediately.
Right. Okay, great. Our next question is, in this time of COVID, how can I manage my loved one's wake and funeral, and and still have it feeling personal and loving?
Okay. I wrote down funerals have not changed for us in this time. As far as the actual funeral goes, it's the same thing. We're either going to church, we're going to a service, we're doing a service in the funeral home. What has changed is the way that funerals are, calling hours are conducted. If we have calling hours, we're expecting a few people besides the family that's already in the building. We will limit 10 people at a time to come in, pay their respects, and have them move forward. And we try to tell folks, especially when we were at the height of all of this, as you're going through, please, no physical contact. I know it's hard. You want to hug somebody, and people do. You can't tell them absolutely no, you can't, or the nets are going to fall from the ceiling and drag you away. We are, when we're consoling somebody, the first thing you want to do is give them a hug. And this is the hardest thing to try to refrain from at this time. We keep hand sanitizer at the doors. You come in. We're requiring folks to wear masks. All of these things, try to send a couple of people through at a time. It does extend some of the times, but people thankfully are a little more aware of all of this and understand, geez, I can't stand and talk to you about, how great it was that we were at grandma's house, 40 years ago. You can talk about that at the luncheon afterwards if they have one. Try to keep it to what you want to do. You still have the opportunity to pay your respects. You can still go and look at the photos and the collages, the videos, look through what the flowers that were given, have a chance to talk to a few people before you exit the building. You can still have the services you were having before.
The next question we have is, what is prearranged funeral and what are the benefits? You did talk about this in the beginning, actually.
Okay. Prearranged funeral is, as I said earlier, it's making funeral arrangements for a future death. What are some of the benefits? And this is a question you've got to ask when you talk to funeral homes. Do you guarantee your prices? That's a big one. Most funeral homes will tell you that we guarantee the price of the goods and services of the funeral home, which means when we do the removal, the service charge for the funeral home itself, our casket that we're providing for the funeral, the vault, all of those things, which should be on the left side of your statement of goods and services. On the right side, on a prearrangement, you have what's called cash advances, which would be the cemetery, the crematory, a newspaper. It can be with prearrangements, we used to put in monies for flowers and for luncheons afterwards. But the state has told us you're not allowed to put in for luncheon anymore. Some people look at prearrangements as a way to hide assets from Mass Health, and that's not really what they're meant for. They're meant for the disposition of the person at the time it comes. And just because you're coming to the end of your assets, if you're in a nursing home or what have you, doesn't mean that you have to skimp from what you would traditionally have done. They don't penalize you for doing that. However, if they see that you've bought a $32,000 sarcophagus and you've got another $7,000 vault and you've got this, that, and the other, they might question, was this what you normally would do? Those are things. But as I said earlier, ask, do you guarantee your prices? Now, if a funeral home tells you, oh, no, we don't guarantee prices, that's crazy. 10 years from now, everything's going to cost more. Well, that's why you put it into something that tries to keep up with inflation, with the cost of living. Those things that the funeral home do, the goods and services that are specifically us, we will guarantee them. We've lost money on them in the past, but for the most part, it breaks even. The other side, as I said, the newspaper, the cemeteries or what have you, we can't guarantee those.
Right.
My grandmother's brother prearranged with us, and 2 months after he prearranged, this was when we were still putting in the cemetery costs and guaranteeing everything. The cemetery changed the price of the opening of the grave from $400 to $900 in 2 months. I lost $400 right there.
Wow.
So it's, you realize that there are things that you can guarantee and that you cannot. I have no control over the newspaper, over the cemeteries. If you can prepay a cemetery, and some cemeteries will allow you to do this, I suggest you do it. It locks you into today's prices. As far as I've seen in 37 years, I've not seen anything go down in price. Well, I shouldn't say that. Welfare has not changed in the 30-something years I've been here. They used, I think, vaguely remember in the early 80s, I think they were giving us $300 for a welfare funeral, and they went to $1,100, and it hasn't changed since.
Wow.
So if you can prearrange, even if you can't, you say, well, we should, but I can't afford this right now. There are some insurances that allow you to do payment plans, just like regular life insurance does, that allow you, they give you a payment schedule. So just like a car, you're sending in so much a month. I did this for myself and my wife. We were going on a trip 10 years ago, and it was the first time I had flown in years, and said, something happens, I want to be protected. And we spent the next, I forget how many years, making payments towards that until they were paid up.
Great. Now, we have a couple more questions. It is 7 o'clock. Is that okay if we ask a few more?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I should tell you, by the way, that if you prearrange at a funeral home, it doesn't mean you have to stay there.
Oh.
Prearrangements are transferable. Most funeral homes don't want you to know that and don't like the idea of a prearrangement being moved, but they are transferable. As I said earlier, that money's not ours.
Right.
Until we fulfill that contract, it is not our money.
That's good information. Our next question, kind of on this same topic, is what is burial insurance?
Burial insurance is essentially a form of life insurance that at death pays directly to the funeral home, usually, because it's the funeral home that's supplying this insurance. And it's meant to cover the cost of a funeral.
Great. If a person dies, if the person who dies has a life insurance policy, can I use that to pay for the funeral?
Now, by that question, I'm guessing you mean, can I give the policy to the funeral home and ask them to use it for the funeral? Yes, you can. There are forms that are available to us from insurance companies that are assignment of benefits, that we have to show them what the burial expenses were, and they will pay us directly from the policy and then pay the remainder to the family.
Okay.
9 times out of 10, a family will come in and say, well, geez, Dad had life insurance, and well, you're going to have to wait until we get the money from the insurance, and then we'll pay you. We understand that, and it does happen. There are situations where folks can afford to pay for the funeral, but won't because they have the life insurance. So we wind up waiting sometimes a month, 2 months before they get the life insurance monies that come in, and then they give it to us, as opposed to, it's the same thing with an estate. If you pay for the funeral expenses for someone who's died, that it's going into an estate. You then give that bill to the executor of the estate, and they will take care of dispersing those funds when the funds are available to you to pay you back. And if you can do that, most funeral homes appreciate at least a down payment to help us cover our expenses at the time of death.
Who is legally responsible for funeral costs?
Generally, the person who comes in and makes arrangements and signs the funeral contract, it's a legally binding contract that you're making between whomever is making the arrangements in the funeral home. That being said, it's not always the same person. There are situations where someone comes in to make arrangements, but they're not the ones paying for the funeral. They're doing it on someone else's behalf who either can't be here or don't want to be here. That happens. Who's legally responsible for it? Generally, the person who signs the bill. Now, even if you take that bill back to the person who's going to pay for it and have them sign it, which we would much prefer you have done, that way it's a contract between us and the people that are actually paying for things. But in the long run, we've had situations in the past where we've had to try to chase folks for monies that either started making payment plans, which we will still accept. If you give us something every month, as long as it's continually coming in, we're generally happy with that. But I always find a problem with that because folks tend to say, well, gee, the gas bill's too high this month, or the kids need something. And I'm going to tell you, I would take care of my kids before I would pay a bill.
Right.
Who wouldn't? So, that's why you'll find a lot of funeral homes will tell you, we don't do payment plans. We'll have a contract with you. We'll give you a piece of paper. I have one. I've never given it to a family that gives you 3 options for the funeral. You pay at the time of arrangements, you pay at the day of the funeral, or if it goes to an estate, there's a fee that's put onto the bill, generally between $300 and $500, and then interest is added to the funeral bill itself when it goes to an estate. Because if it's gone to an estate with a lawyer, then obviously you're dealing with a much more protracted period of time before payments can be made to the funeral home.
So it would be the person who signs the bill. Would that be if no one maybe claimed, say, no one said, I don't want to take care of this? Would it be the power of attorney, or is there a list of next of kin? What if someone said, we don't want to pay for anything?
If there's a lawyer involved, sometimes it's a lawyer.
Okay.
If there is nobody that wants to pay for the funeral, then you have to step back and say, well, then what are we doing? Is it a question of, do they have assets? Don't they have assets? Which you've asked further down. I don't want to get too deep into that now, but generally somebody will step forward and say, listen, I'll take care of this. But it's very rare you get a situation where if there's 4 children, all 4 say, I'm not being responsible. I don't want to do this. Then you're kind of left in limbo. Well, if you're not responsible, then realistically, I'm not being contracted by you either. So then the person is in limbo until either somebody kind of says, hey, listen, you guys got to do something. Or somebody else in the family steps forward and says, oh, for heaven's sake, I'll take care of it.
Right.
These new Gen Xers.
The next question we have is, what can I do with limited funds to bury my loved one? And what if I can't pay for services? How do I get assistance?
Okay. A lot of that depends on what your finances are before you go into that. Are you eligible for assistance? Is the decedent eligible for assistance? There are some people who are just, and there's no shame in this, just poor. They don't have the assets to do this sort of thing. And that's generally when we go back and say, well, can you talk to some other family members? Can you figure out some way of, do you have a credit card that's available? Most funeral homes will take a credit card. As I said before, we will do a payment plan. But as I've said, unless you've got no other things going on in your life, and that's not anybody that I know of, payment plans a lot of times break down after a period of time. You know, we had a lady that was giving us payments over several years who gave us the last payment that she was going to give us and said, "I paid you enough, I'm done." She was a saucy old lady who was owned a farm, and she said, "Yep, that's it, I'm done." She was fairly close. We did at one point use a payment recovery service, and I got to tell you, it was a nightmare for us. I hate chasing people.
Yeah.
And I don't like sending other people to chase them either. To me, it leaves a bad taste not only in my mouth, but in the family's mouths. That being said, I've had people walk in, make arrangements, and say, you know, we're going to have calling hours, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we'll have a service in the funeral home, and then we'll cremate them afterwards. And you go through all of this. Now, you've received nothing at the beginning. You're expecting somewhere in here you're going to get paid, and they give you nothing, and they disappear. And you call, nobody answers. You send letters, nobody responds. You send certified mail, nobody signs for it. Those get written off eventually as bad debt. We have sent collection agencies. We used them for 1 year, and it was horrible. And I vowed to my business partner, we won't do this again. I don't like it. Granted, if the family called back and said, "Oh, geez, now Dad died, we want to do the same thing for Dad." Well, geez, either you can come forward with what you owe us for Mom before we talk about Dad, or you can ask another funeral home if they're interested in taking care of your family. Now, that being said, as funeral homes, if we've had a family that has done that to us in the past, and we see the family's gone someplace else, we generally have a relationship with the other funeral directors who will pick up the phone and call and say, "Listen, I'm not trying to cause trouble. Just to let you know, we had a hard time with payment." It's more of a professional courtesy than it is anything else. Is it right to do? I don't know. But frankly, I would want someone to tell me,
Right.
rather than finding out afterwards.
Absolutely. The next question is similar. It's about government aid to help cover costs. There's a couple different options. We have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA benefit.
Well, under 17A, you had how do I get funeral assistance in Massachusetts?
I forgot about that. Sorry.
And I had written pray for a miracle.
Oh no.
They over the last year they've gotten better, but they became very punitive with us because they didn't want to pay us. As I said, the $1,100 they've allowed us for the last 30-something years has not changed. What has changed is they allow us to bill up to $3,500 for the total funeral. And that would include if you were going to bury somebody, that burial expense is supposed to come out of that. In Massachusetts, for a short period of time, they told us that if your brother passed away and he was on Mass Health, he was receiving Medicaid, he was not working, couldn't work, disability, whatever the situation was, and he passed away, they would ask us to have the family fill out a 3-page form of information, including not the decedent's, but the family's assets. And if the family had enough liquid assets, they would tell us, yeah, we're not paying for that. The family can afford it. Why are they asking us? Not the fact that they're entitled to it or have been all these years, but they made it very difficult to the point where a lot of funeral homes, if you call them and tell them this is a welfare call, they will tell you on the phone, well, you need to call somebody else. We don't deal with those. Or when do you want to pick up the cremation? Don't ask about viewing, don't ask about services. We will give you a cremation and nothing else. We try to do a little bit more with that. More recently, because of the pandemic, we have stepped back a little bit from what we were asking families for. If a person's entitled to the money from the state, which is $1,100, if they have no other assets, and that includes a debit card with $20 on it. If you got $20 on it, you have to get that account, show it to the state. The state says, oh, okay, then we're deducting $20 from the $1,100.
Wow.
Any asset they find, they deduct from the $1,100. And that doesn't mean they're going to approve you for it. So what we wind up telling a family is, this would normally cost, let's say, $3,500 for everything. We are willing to accept the $1,100 from the state. However, we work on an honor system. I know it's old-fashioned, but we still do it. If there are assets that are found, if you're asking me for a death certificate because he has an insurance policy, well, then the state is out of the question. Anything that the person has that becomes an asset, the state will not pay out. And we tell folks, if this is truly the case, we'll honor the $1,100 from the state. But if the state doesn't give it, we expect the family to come up with it. It's not easy, especially if there's nothing anywhere. You know, you've got young kids that are involved, or you've got people that are out of work. It can be very difficult. And you see a lot of people doing GoFundMe pages. Personally, stepping aside totally from a funeral director's point of view, my wife and I have had the discussion, why am I paying for your funeral? And I'm not the only person to ask that question. If you've got a funeral for somebody, even if it's unexpected, there's got to be other family members that can come forward. There's got to be friends that can come forward. And if not, work out something with the funeral home. I've actually had people call us, will we make a donation for a funeral that's at a different funeral home? We've essentially told them in a very nice way, why don't you ask your funeral director for a donation instead of calling us?
Wow.
It's a touchy subject. It truly is.
So then you did answer actually some of this. So the couple here is Social Security. We went over the Mass Health benefit,
Okay.
The VA.
Social Security. If your husband or wife dies, you're allowed $255 from Social Security.
Oh, wow.
That's it. If you are a married couple that, let's say you're retired, and your Social Security income is higher than your spouse's, yours continues, theirs stops, or whatever the scenario might be. Whomever was getting the larger of the two checks, that one remains, but you do lose the second one. And depending on when you get paid from the state, not the state, Social Security, they will come forward and tell you that he died before the 3rd of the month, which means that the check he just got, which is for the previous month, not the month you're going into, always get paid retroactively. You're not entitled to that check because you have to live to a certain day of the month to get it. So they'll tell you, don't touch that money because they will pull it back out. And if it's gone, they'll want to know where it went and who's got it.
And then we have, Medicare, but we talked about
Yep.
Mass Health. So Medicaid.
Well, Medicaid is Mass Health.
Is yes,
Medicare is not.
Yes, I picked those up on here.
Yeah, it's easy to mix the two up. You're thinking of Medicare, you think of healthcare when you think of Medicare. Right. When you're thinking of Medicaid, think of welfare. I know that's a broad stroke of a pen, but think of it in those terms. Now, you've got veterans underneath that,
Yeah.
If we have folks that served in the armed services and have little or no assets, we can get up to $4,000 from the veterans. We generally contact the local veterans office, we talk to them, and we'll figure out some way of helping to pay, even if it's a portion of the funeral. We can get up to $4,000 from the vets. But like I said, if there's assets of any sort, if they had bank accounts, numerous homes, they're going to look at you and say, well, why are we paying this? They've got, it may not be liquid, but they do have assets. And those are things that come into question.
Our next question is, what documents will I need to collect when someone dies?
Now, my question for you is, collect from whom?
So if someone died, what should I know to bring to you? What's an
Oh, okay.
thing to collect?
Well, the only thing we really need is a social security number. A lot of the other stuff we can get. We have had a couple of situations in the past year where we have folks telling us that they're married, but they're not. A lot of times there are some cultures that if you live together for a period of time, you're my wife. And they go forward telling folks this, which it's accepted, but it's not legal. And there can be situations where you say you're married, but you're really not. And we have other family members stepping forward saying they're not married. She has no right to make arrangements for him. That situation, thankfully, doesn't come up often, but it has happened. And at that point, you then have to turn around and say, I need a marriage certificate.
Oh, okay.
All right. So that's what we generally ask for. What you need to ask of a funeral director is certified copies of a death certificate. And when I make arrangements with families, I'll ask them, and I always ask them, please make a mental accounting. I don't want to know what your family does or does not have. It's none of my business. I'm not looking to inquire into your personal affairs, but I'll say to them, do you still own your house? Is your name on a mortgage, or the decedent's name on that mortgage? Are there bank accounts that the person has? Do they have insurances? Now, in today's day and age, there's people who have like 4 different insurances, and they can be term insurances, which help cover that short term when your kids are going through school. So if something happens to you, you can help them pay for their schooling. So you've got to ask the questions, is there insurances? Are they from the same company? Do you have accounts? Are they all at the same bank? Each bank will require a certified copy of the death certificate. Each insurance company will want a certified copy. Social Security does not. We file a form from a funeral home that's called a statement of death by a funeral director. And it informs Social Security that this person has died, and it starts the paperwork in motion with Social Security. We always recommend to a family that you follow up with Social Security to talk to them and find out what are your options with them, what's going to happen going forward. Are the monies that are in the account from the last checks that came in still mine, or will one of them get returned? I have minor children. Am I entitled to anything from Social Security for that? Those are things that you really need to have a conversation with them about, because they're the experts. They're the ones that are going to tell you, oh, your husband died, you have minor children. They're now entitled to income from his Social Security. You're entitled to something from it. Even if you're not married to this person anymore and you're raising his or her children, those things come into play. And that's part of the things that we try to have a family to talk to them, to instruct them to go talk to Social Security after the fact.
Thank you. Our next one is, what do we do when a veteran dies? And how do I bury my loved one in a military cemetery with a military service?
Okay. If your loved one was a veteran, and they wanted, or you want them to be buried with either military honors locally or with military honors in a veteran cemetery. There are two things you can do. If you decide to have a full traditional funeral, your funeral home will help you make these arrangements. That's pretty much what we do. We contact all of these different entities. We make sure that everything's lined up and set for the dates and times that you're looking to have them. It's our job to make sure that we have all of the paperwork needed for that, including the honorable discharge, and make arrangements for the services to take place at the specific date and time if it's at a military cemetery, either in Bourne or in Winchendon, wherever it happens to be. The active military used to come out to do services at the cemetery for members of the military that have died. Now, it does not have to be an active military member that's died. It can be a veteran of a war. And they used to send out a contingent of people to do a brief service at the graveside, presentation of the flag, playing taps. As far as I know, I don't think they're doing it right now, and it's because of COVID. But the local veterans groups are still doing them. So we can do a service at the cemetery, or even if you're not going to have a burial afterwards, where someone's going to be cremated after a service, either in a church or at the funeral home. We have had the military honors done outside. We'll bring the casket outside if it's a casket, and we'll have the military do the service either in the parking lot here or at the parking lot of the church or wherever it is it's going to be done. Because generally you don't want them firing guns in the building.
Right. We have two more questions.
Sure.
So our second to last one is, who do I talk to about writing an obituary, and how do I do it? And do I need one?
Okay. If you're making arrangements with a funeral home, most funeral homes will, through the information you've given them, write up an obituary for you. Now, to a lot of people, that's, yeah, okay, that's what I want to do. To a lot of other folks, I want to have some input. I want it a little bit more personalized than just saying they went to school, they went to church, they died. I want something more personalized. I much prefer to say to a family, if we have the time, and we don't always have this luxury, give me your email address. I will type up the obituary in the basic format that we like to use, send it to you, add in whatever you'd like to add in, change what you want to change, send it back to us. We may make a couple of tweaks to it from there. Generally grammatical. My business partner is a former English teacher and used to teach French and Latin, so some days it can be pure hell, but he tends to be a stickler for grammar, and we want to put our best foot forward when it comes to something that the public reads. You don't want someone calling up and saying, that's wrong, or that's not right. Not just informationally, but grammatically. It makes the family look bad. It makes us look bad.
Right.
Most of the time, a funeral director will or should help you write an obituary. There are some funeral homes that are all about what's the least expensive way we can dispose of somebody. And they'll advertise that right there. We're the cheapest when it comes to this. We're the cheapest when it comes to that. Don't expect a lot in service. If you're looking to do something that is bare bones, no services, a lot of them are almost becoming like a factory where we do 1,500 calls a year. So I don't have time to sit with you and write a note, but just send it to me and we'll put it in the paper. That's not all of them, but it does happen.
And then our last question is, what if I need grief support after the funeral is over?
There are several different counseling areas available to families. If you've had a death of a child, there is a group specifically for that. And for the life of me, it's not coming to me. A friend of mine's child had died, and she became very active in the group. and it's specifically geared towards helping other parents deal with the loss of a child. Um, if you're on hospice, a lot of times hospices offer to their families counseling either through a minister or a
Social
person.
worker, that's what we do.
I'm sorry.
We have our social workers do it.
Okay.
Through bereavement, yes.
There are some hospices that will talk to you before the fact, and we've had a lot of families tell us that, you know, a lot of their discussions that they had, a lot of their insight into what we were going through, into what our family member was going through, was tremendous. And a lot of hospices will even offer some follow-up, either through group sessions or through a little bit of counsel. I've not known of any that specifically say, oh, we offer a full counseling service afterwards. They're meant to really get you through a very difficult period of time. And hopefully both you and the person who's died come to the end of life with dignity, with respect, in such a way that it's something that you feel better for having gone through it. I've got to tell you, I find that a lot of people who shy away from being at a person's bedside or helping somebody who's at end of life, I feel that they've lost out on a tremendous opportunity to get to know somebody better, to get to know them on a level that they never would have gotten to know them. Even if it's your own mother, you're going to find that if you're there for them at end of life stages and you're helping walk them through these last times, you find those are the folks at the funerals that aren't crying. And they're not crying because they don't miss mom. They're crying because they were there for them. A lot of the people that come in sometimes are crying because of guilt. I didn't do stuff when I should have done it. I have regrets. You will never go to your grave saying, geez, I'm sorry, I went on this trip to Florida. You tend to be more regretful for the things that you didn't do. And that being said, I always try to tell folks, take the opportunity to be there. You're afraid, but so are they. Take that opportunity to get to know them, to be there, and you'll be a better person for it.
Well, thank you so much. This was beyond anybody's, I think, expectations. This was so helpful. We're very, very grateful for the time that you took out. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Is there any?
Probably because I talk too much.
No, because you covered everything so thoroughly. This was awesome.
So
really
awesome.
Very nice.
Yeah, this has been very helpful.
Yeah.
Great.
If you have questions going forward, there's, people tell you, oh, I'm not going to call a funeral home and ask a question. Well, what are we there for? If you call a funeral director and ask a question and they don't want to answer it, or they don't have time for you to answer it, then ask yourself, why are you calling them? If they can't make the time for you when you need them, even if, there's no such thing as a stupid question. We consider most of what we do, we think that everybody knows what we do because it's what we do. It's the same with nurses. It's the same with hospices. A lot of times you find that you don't realize that people don't know as much as you do about a situation. They haven't been working in this for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm always surprised at how much some people don't know, because you just expect that because I know it, they must know it. And it's not always the case.
We had Sheila and I had a situation today, actually, where a family member misunderstood something. It was someone we referred to the ME, but the ME didn't take the case. But the family thought they were still saying they needed an autopsy. But what was going on, it was the state rule because there was a direct cremation. that the medical examiner had to sign off on it. But they took that they had to have an autopsy. So it was a big, you have a grieving family who hasn't slept in days, misunderstood something. And I called the funeral home and they just said, oh, nope, this is what it is. It's no big deal. Everything's all set. Just reassure them. This is, it's just little checkbox.
In the time of COVID, the medical examiner's office is no longer viewing every single person who's being cremated. It was their policy previously to go to the crematory. They had a representative that would go. They would go over all of the paperwork that was sent from the funeral home, and they would view the person. But because of COVID, they decided for the safety of their own personnel, they're not going to expose themselves to what usually is an unembalmed body. So as a result, you get folks that come through and you tell them there's a fee for the medical examiner. Well, why are we getting charged for that? Well, that's the state. The state tells us we owe them $200 for the medical examiner to process this cremation, even though they're not seeing them right now. But hopefully they will again. You want them to look at every single person. There's a lot of times they'll look at the cause of death. Sometimes you'll find that a medical examiner or the representative who's at the crematory will say, I don't like the way this all looks. I recommend we bring the person back. Now, that being said, we're talking about an autopsy. I had a family that the person died of a drug overdose. It's unfortunate, but it's no longer a rare occurrence. And the father of the deceased, there is a form from the medical examiner's office that you can fill out that says you do not want that person autopsied. Now, will they honor it? They will take it into consideration. This person was not autopsied. They were examined. They took blood samples, but they weren't autopsied. But there is the option of telling the medical examiner, I will fill out a form that says I absolutely do not want him or her touched. And there are people that do that either for religious reasons, or they just don't want their child who's been through hell and back for whatever reason it was that they went through and they died. But that is an option. So if you find yourself dealing with the medical examiner's office someday and they say, we want to examine them, you do have the option of saying that we don't want an autopsy. Now, granted, as I said, they have final say in the state over any and every dead body that's in the state, and they can and will overrule you if they deem it necessary.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Jess, I just had one quick question. I actually work out in the Worcester area, and it's been my experience in the last several years, a lot of the family-run funeral homes have been taken over by like these huge conglomerate type, but they don't change the name, so you don't know that. Is there any way that you can find, I'm just assuming, but I personally would rather stay with or recommend the smaller family-owned, because it's been my experience that they work much more intimately and provide service to the families. Can you find that information out?
They actually have to disclose that to you if you inquire, are you family-owned? Do you have any corporate part of your funeral service that's owned by a corporation, or are you fully owned by a corporation? We actually have to have on the wall, as you come into the building, a sign that tells you the name of the funeral home and who owns it. Now, in the case of the two funeral homes we run, it's the name of the funeral home, my business partner's name, and mine underneath it. And we were told that the letters have to be almost 1 inch high. So it can't be something that's so minuscule you can't read it. It should be prominently displayed. And if you're not sure, call the corporation or the funeral home. Most funeral homes, by the way, are incorporated, and that's mostly for tax and legal purposes. But we are not owned by a corporation. And as far as I know, none of us in town here or even the surrounding towns are owned by a corporation.
Thanks, that was so helpful.
Sure.
My dog is upset, but so if you hear barking in the background, any other questions? Sorry.
You know, if you go forward and you find that after we hang up, somebody says, oh darn, I wish I had asked this, send the question to either Kim or Jess, and they can forward it to me, and I'll do my best to answer it. If I don't have an answer, I'll try to find something for you.
Oh,
Thank you so much. This was so helpful, and I'm happy we have it
Thank you.
recorded.
You're welcome.
Yes,
We'll talk to
Hopefully,
you soon.
hopefully you all stay well.
Yes,
yes,
Okay.
you as well.
thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.